Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature, and today we have traveled out into the desert. We are in Phoenix, Arizona at Chase Field to take our final of 3 excursions from the traditional prophetic books. Today we're going to talk about 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and it's appropriate that we do so here in Phoenix, this city named after the mythical bird that rises out of its own ashes, because that's what Judaism had to do after the central event in these books, the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt occurred under King Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the Seleucid Greek king who sought to impose Greek values and Greek practices upon the Jews and indeed prescribe death for anyone who dared to resist. Judaism rose again after some courageous fighting by the Maccabees, for whom the book is named. We'll delve more into this in a moment. Let's look at our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit more about this history, and then we'll look at each of the 2 books in sequence. But before we do any of that, we need to say something about 1st and 2nd Maccabees that's not true of the other so-called numbered books. Maccabees is not like Samuel, Kings, or Chronicles. We said that Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles were books written in sequence and originally were one book. The division occurred later. That's not true of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These 2 books were written separately. Indeed, scholars think that 1st Maccabees was written in Hebrew and has a more traditional theology. Think of it as position more conservative. Whereas 2nd Maccabees was likely written in Greek and contains a more progressive theology. Both books cover the same era. They're 2 different versions of the same events told from 2 different perspectives. So let's look a little bit more into this history. What led these 2 books to be written? Just by way of reminder, we look at the major macro overview of prophetic history. We can think of it as 5 main eras. Everything before the mid-8th century was a time where there wasn't an empire that was dominating Israel. Israel and Judah, the northern and southern kingdoms respectively, existed independently and competed for position with Aram, that is Syria, Moab, Edom, we could add Ammon to the list, Philistia, other smaller kingdoms. But that all changes in the mid-8th century with the rise of the Assyrian Empire, especially under Tiglath-Pileser III. Then the Babylonians ultimately conquer the Assyrians. Of course, the Babylonians also take the southern kingdom into exile. The Persians under King Cyrus allow the Jews to return from exile. But then in 332, the Greeks conquer the Persians. You can see on your screen here that everything in brown is the post-exilic period. We're now in the very late post-exilic period. Let's look at some of the key events from this Hellenistic era, this Greek era. In 332, Alexander the Great of Greece supplanted Persian control. He conquered the Holy Land. Over time, after Alexander the Great died, there wasn't a clear succession plan, so a number of smaller kingdoms arose. For the longest time, the Ptolemies, which were headquartered at Alexandria in what is today northern Egypt, held sovereignty over the Holy Land. But in the year 200 BC, Antiochus III, a Seleucid, the Seleucid kingdom, was headquartered at the city of Antioch on the Orontes River in what is today far southern Turkey. It's near Seleucia. In 200 BC, the Seleucids took control of the Holy Land, which had been ruled by the Ptolemies. 10 years later, in 190 BC, Antiochus III is defeated by the Romans and has a problem. He needs money. And so one of the consequences of that is he begins to sell the high priesthood. The high priesthood in this time was what passed for Jewish independence. In the post-exilic period, the Jews were not able to resume the Davidic monarchy. They couldn't. They never had a king in the way they did before the exile. The high priesthood was the closest thing to home rule. So the high priesthood goes up for sale. Around this time, so around 175 BC, a number of important things happen. One is Antiochus IV Epiphanes becomes the Seleucid king up in Syria, and you have an accommodationist party and more of a separatist party within Judaism. Jason is an accommodationist who buys the high priesthood, and then later another accommodationist, Menelaus, outbids him. So the official leaders of Judaism at this time are quite content to conform to Greek practices. But this upsets the more conservative, more pious Jews of a more separatist bent. So you can see this ideological division within Judaism at the time. In 169 BC, the pious Jews revolt against Jason and Menelaus, which makes King Antiochus IV Epiphanes unhappy. He punishes the pious Jews and indeed prescribes the death penalty for anyone observing Jewish practices. Think circumcision, think the Sabbath, think the food laws. All of this is depicted in our 2 books, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This provokes a revolt by pious Jews. Led by Mattathias and his son Judas Maccabeus, as well as his brothers, this whole family is known as the Hasmoneans. They lead what we now call the Maccabean Revolt between 167 and 164. Long story short, in 164 BC, the Romans agree to support the Hasmoneans, the revolt ends, and Antiochus IV Epiphanes dies in what is now Iran. Also, the Feast of the Dedication, known to us today as Hanukkah, is instituted. So let's delve into the particulars of the two books, beginning with 1st Maccabees. You can see on our outline here, I'm going to take both outlines from the same author. On this outline, 1st Maccabees has a fourfold structure. You have Mattathias, who is the father of all of the Hasmoneans, and then you have three of his sons, Judas, Jonathan, Simon, all of whom succeed one another as the leaders of the Jewish people. 1st Maccabees is notable for its focus on the wars. It especially focuses on the military and diplomatic exploits of all that's happening during this time period. I want to focus, however, on two specific things that are notable here in 1st Maccabees. The first is the origins of Hanukkah. So this is after the Maccabean Revolt has ended. We read, "Then Judas and his brothers and the entire assembly of Israel decreed that every year for 8 days, the days of the dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness on the anniversary." This is after the altar in the temple, which had been desecrated by offering sacrifices to Zeus. The altar was rededicated and regular temple sacrifice was offered. This is notable, this Feast of the Dedication, not only because it continues to be celebrated by Jews today, it's also notable when we look at the Gospel of John, which we'll do in the New Testament courses. The Gospel of John, significant things happen in connection with the Feast of the Dedication. You'll find that in John chapter 10, the second part of the Good Shepherd discourse. Something else notable in 1st Maccabees occurs 2 chapters later, when we get an insight into what Antiochus was thinking on his deathbed. "But now I recall the evils I did in Jerusalem, when I carried away all the vessels of silver and gold that were in it. I know that is why these evils have overtaken me." Notable here is the traditional, almost Deuteronomistic sounding theodicy. Antiochus is dying and suffering because he was unfaithful, because he was unjust, and he's being rightly punished for that. And now let's look at 2nd Maccabees. Here we have a greater reflection on the events of the Maccabean Revolt itself. Notable in 2nd Maccabees are the many stories about the martyrs, those who are killed because they refuse to violate the law, and the promise they have and the hope they have of the resurrection. This is very unique in the Old Testament. We're going to draw attention today to 2nd Maccabees chapter 7, this famous story of the mother with her 7 sons, all of whom are being tortured and killed because of their refusal to eat pork in violation of God's law. And notice what the mother says, according to 2nd Maccabees 7. She says, "Therefore, since it is the Creator of the universe, who shaped the beginning of humankind and brought about the origin of everything, He in His mercy will give you back both breath and life, because you now disregard yourselves for the sake of His law." Notice 3 things about this quotation. First, it's theology of creation. It is in this very chapter that we get the explicit affirmation of creatio ex nihilo, the idea of creation created out of nothing. Also, the idea of the resurrection of the body. So you have creation and you have eschatology, this idea and this sense that God will vindicate those who suffer in the present life in an afterlife. And also notice the prominence of the law, that the law, God's divine instruction, Torah, is worth suffering for. We also see in 2nd Maccabees how the Hasmoneans aligned themselves with Rome. They saw Rome as a hedge against further Seleucid incursions on their religious liberty. All of this would backfire in 63 BC when Pompey would invade and conquer the Holy Land, setting up the Roman occupation that's the backdrop of the entire New Testament. 2nd Maccabees 11 says, "The Romans also sent them," the them being the Jews, "a letter as follows: What Lysias, kinsman of the king, has granted you, we also approve." So there's that promise of religious toleration that was so important in that time. Thus concludes our backdrop of the prophetic literature. Beginning in our next class, we're going to start looking at the specifically prophetic books, the posterior prophets, the ones we're all familiar with. Until then, read well and pray well.